We've reached about the halfway point of the books of Samuel. Now, often Bible stories will come in pairs with something sandwiched between in a ABA type pattern. For example, in last Sunday's gospel reading from Mark chapter 5, there's the story of Jairus' daughter, the synagogue leader's daughter, who is deathly ill. And her story brackets the healing of the hemorrhaging woman. And so this is called an inclusio. And when you get a whole bunch of inclusios stacked together, like A, B, C, D, C, B, A, with D in the middle, this is called a chiasmus. And this pattern in biblical storytelling helps with remembering stories before they were written down for oral storytelling. And it also calls attention to what's on the outside and what's in the center. So 1st and 2nd Samuel, the books of Samuel, are arranged in a chiasmus. So it starts and ends with poems, or 2 poems or songs of praise. At the beginning, there's Hannah's song or prayer in chapter 2 of 1 Samuel. And it ends with David's last testament in 2 Samuel chapter 23. And that song of David's song of praise at the end of his life contains many of the same elements as Hannah's song at the very beginning of the story. So in the very middle of the books of Samuel, then there are these 2 stories about David sparing Saul's life in chapter 24 and chapter 26 of 1 Samuel. And actually, in the middle of these 2, Samuel dies. So only the first half is Samuel really present. And then chapter 25, there's this interesting story about a woman in between. So to back up a little bit, recap. After David defeated Goliath, Saul makes David as commander in his army. And David wins lots and lots of battles against the Philistines, and he gets more and more popular. And it says many times, the woman would sing, Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. And as you might imagine, Saul would hear this song about how awesome David was, how much more awesome David was than Saul. And Saul got a little jealous. In fact, Saul got really jealous and really worried that David was trying to take his throne. Saul was so afraid of David and his success that he tried to have David killed. So eventually David had to flee Saul's court, leaving behind his wife Michal, Saul's daughter, and his best friend Jonathan, Saul's son. And Saul chased David. There's like 10 chapters. The last 10 chapters of 1 Samuel are all about Saul chasing David and David fighting Philistines while he runs away, while he evades Saul. So David gathers his family and other misfits around him so that he ends up with a guerrilla band of a few hundred followers hiding in the hills. So, one time, when Saul was looking for David, Saul went into a cave to use the bathroom. Little did Saul know that David and his men were, in fact, in the back of the cave, hiding from Saul. So David's men see Saul coming and squatting there. And while Saul's doing his business, they say to David, "Here's your chance. God's delivered Saul right into your hand. You can do whatever you please with him." So while Saul's doing his business, David sneaks up behind him and cuts a corner off his cloak, then goes back to his men. And David immediately feels bad about this. He tells his men that Saul is God's anointed king. Even if God has regretted making him king, he's still the king. So Saul finishes and gets up and leaves the cave, and David follows. And he calls to Saul, "Hey, Saul, my Lord and King," and he bows down to Saul. and shows him the corner of the cloak that he cut off and says to Saul, "Why don't you trust me? I could have killed you in there, but I didn't." And Saul acknowledges that David was in the right, and they go their separate ways. And then 2 chapters later, it happens again. Saul again takes his army, 3,000 soldiers, it says, to find David. And then, while Saul is sleeping in the center of the camp, surrounded by his entire army, David and one of his men sneak into the camp at night. And they go straight to Saul, and nobody sees them. And there's Saul, fast asleep, with his favorite weapon, his spear, right beside him. The spear is the weapon that Saul has tried to kill David with twice. And next to Saul is Abner, the military commander. And the man with David again says, "God's given your enemy right into your hand. Let me kill him quickly for you." And David again says, "No, this is God's anointed one. Don't lay a hand on him." Instead, David takes Saul's spear and a jug of water that's sitting there, and they go, and no one sees them leave. So they climb to the top of a hill nearby, and David calls back, "Oh, Abner!" And Abner wakes up and says, Who is it?" David says, "You've not done a very good job of guarding your lord the king. Looks what's missing, Saul's spear here and the water jug." And Saul recognized David's voice and says, "Is that you, David?" And David says, "Yes, it is. Why do you hunt me? I've done you no wrong." Saul acknowledged that David was in the right. And he says, "Blessed be you, my son David. You will do many things and succeed in them." And they go their separate ways again. And in between these 2 ridiculously similar stories is the story of Nabal and Abigail. So Nabal is a wealthy landowner. He's got 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. And while they're shearing the sheep, David comes by them, and he sends his messengers, 10 fighting men, to Nabal and asks for food in exchange for protecting Nabal's sheep. It's getting a little iffy here, morally, because it's unclear whether David's really been protecting his sheep. We haven't heard. The narrator has not told us that David's protecting his sheep. Or if this is a protection racket, David's being like a mafia boss, and there's really a threat here. In any case, Nabal refuses to give David anything. And in response, when the messengers come back to David, David says, "Everyone get your sword, let's go." Meanwhile, one of the young men warns Abigail, Nabal's wife. He says, "David sent messengers out of the wilderness to salute our master, and he shouted insults at them. Yet the men were very good to us, and we suffered no harm, and we never missed anything when we were in the fields as long as we were with them. They were a wall to us both by night and by day, all the while we were with them keeping the sheep. Now therefore know this, and consider what you should do, for evil has been decided against our master and all his house. He is so ill-natured that no one can speak to him." Then Abigail hurried and took 200 loaves, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep ready dressed, 5 measures of parched grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 big cakes. She loaded them on donkeys and said to her young men, "Go on ahead of me, I am coming after you." But she did not tell her husband Nabal. As she rode on the donkey and came down under the cover of the mountain, David and his men came toward her, and she met them. Now David had said, "Surely it was in vain that I protected all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him. But he has returned me evil for good. God, do so to David and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him." When Abigail saw David, she hurried and dismounted from the donkey and fell before David on her face, bowing to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, "Upon me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. My Lord, do not take seriously this ill-natured fellow, Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him." That is, his name means fool. "But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent." And Abigail gives this long speech and concludes, "When the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for having saved himself. And when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your servant." And David said to Abigail, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you to meet me today. Blessed be your good sense, and blessed be you who kept me today from blood guilt and from avenging myself by my own hand." So Abigail then goes home and tells her husband Nabal what happened, and he dies of a heart attack a few days later. And she eventually marries David. So that's the story of Abigail and Nabal. What's so important about this story? Why is it at the very center of the books of Samuel? Why is it sandwiched between these two stories of David sparing Saul's life? I think Nabal and Abigail hold a mirror up to David. In this episode, we see the worst of David. He sees himself as the Lord's anointed, and that means that he can do what he pleases. He seems to think that the ends justify the means. Really, David is acting positively Saul-like, seeking unjustified revenge. He's not being a good shepherd. He's destroying his own flock, and he's ruling by fear, taking what is not freely given. But Abigail stops David. She acts as David's best self, as David acts to Saul. She's clever and brave, and she takes the initiative to care for her people. She puts herself on the line to protect them. So that's Abigail, a good queen perhaps, who brings out the best in David when he's at his worst.